and coordinated by a team of researchers and research assistants that who are hired especially for this purpose. What we are doing is to look at how the rights of refugees are changing in the present political context. As you all see, there's a turbulent international political context, which is being projected into also the national context. This turbulence comes from the fact that the nativist and the extreme nationalist political elements in countries are becoming more and more powerful in politics, and they're represented more in national parliaments and in the European Parliament as well. This is consequently leading to demands for change in migration and refugee policies of countries, not only change in policies, but also in laws. We have seen a series of changes in national laws concerning migration now. More restrictive migration policies have been applied to the last 5-6 years, both introduced and applied. And the practice of existing migration laws and policies are becoming more restrictive. They're being both interpreted and applied in more restrictive ways than they are intended, especially in the global north. This includes European countries, the European Union itself, and countries like the United States. And we, even though it is in global south, geographically, Australia can be regarded as part of the global north, at least in economic and ideological and identitarian terms. So these refugee and migrant receiving countries have been applying restrictive policies. This is in spite of the fact that the global economic system requires sharing of resources globally, because poverty and inequality has increased systematically and in structured ways globally. Global South is becoming poorer, and the global north is becoming wealthier. But this doesn't mean that the global north is, the citizens, all citizens of the global north are becoming wealthier. Also, wealth in the global north is being concentrated in the hands of few. This means that the global wealth is being concentrated in the hands of few people who are living and paying taxes and operating in the global north. The new economic system, global economic system, does not need a mobile labor force. It does not need migrant workers any longer. This is basically because of the paces that the digital technologies have made. You can do the job wherever you are. You can move the capital to cheaper places where you can find cheaper labor instead of moving migrants into where factories are, etc., etc. You know all these things. So the new global economy doesn't need migration, because it is very expensive. When you get migrants, you don't get only workers, but you also get people who are going to benefit from the social services and social benefits that are actually meant for the citizens of the global north. So welfare chauvinism has increased, and all these are then being projected into refugee policies. Although countries do not any longer want refugees either, they can do little about this because they have signed under a convention that we call the Convention on the Status of Refugees in 1951, the Geneva Refugee Convention in short. Now, recently, since 2016, there have been attempts by the UNHCR and transnational, international non-governmental organizations that have noticed this predicament for refugees and migrants, and these organizations have been doing a very good and comprehensive work about protecting refugees in this turbulent context. What came out of these efforts are two global compacts. One of them is the Global Compact on Migration. This is the short name for it. And the other is the Global Compact on Refugees. The Global Compact of Refugees does not bring anything new concerning the rights of the refugees, but it tries to mobilize the states to take on their responsibilities according to the refugee convention that they have signed under, that they themselves have created in 1951, and share the burden of the world's refugees. More concerted actions by the states are encouraged by the Global Refugee Compact. What my project is doing is to look at the consequences of the Global Migration Compact and Global Refugee Compact on the international right to protection, on refugees' international right to protection. Now, these global compacts are also in place now as a consequence of a process whereby also the states were involved. And these states, the states have certainly tried to sneak their own interests into this. And for example, when you read the Global Compact on Refugees, you do not see very clear references to human rights. Although refugee rights and the refugee law derive from the International Declaration of Human Rights and other related international law, there is a distinct and visible lack of mention and references to other international law instruments and other the human rights, the recognized human rights systems and norms. One of the things that we will do is to look at how can we make links between the Global Refugee Compact, since there's a process that's going on, and the human rights norms that exist today. So the normative aim of the project is to make the international protection of refugees possible, even though the states can use this opportunity with the Global Compact to make the international refugee protection less related with the human rights norms. So we have many project components here. As you see in the screen, we are going to look at how the rights of refugees might change as a consequence of the processes of the global compacts, and how the governance of the international refugee protection can change as a result of this, and how the recognition of refugees as legitimate individuals in our societies might change, how the perception of refugees might change as legitimate individuals in our societies. If you can go to the second and third very fast, if it works. And these are our partners. I will not talk about them, and but I will just say that they are internationally top scholars in the partnership. And this is the International Advisory Board. As you see, the UNHCR, the organization, the Office of the United Nations High Commissioners for Human Rights is represented, and the European Council on Refugees and Exiles is represented by its director, and again people like Sandra Levanek, Liliana Yuvrut, who's an expert on Brazil and Latin America, etc. And we have also people from South Africa and Middle East. One slide further, please. I will use one more thing. What we do here is that I know that Siri is working about how law transforms society. What we will do in this project is how new law creates new politics, new conflicts, and how we can navigate within this turbulent political context in order to keep the prominence of human rights and refugee protection. These are the normative aims, and I can speak about the practical aspects of the project if there are any questions afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you, Hakan. Very interesting. And I thought it was very fascinating that we have two scholars who look at the issue of protection from different ends. So Hakan, the Protect project looks very much, I mean, it starts at the international level. It looks at different countries, but then we have another project that is starting up that Jessica Schultz from the Law Faculty and Christian Michelsen Institute is embarking on now, which also looks at protection.
Protection, right. Can you hear me? Yeah. Thanks. And I was just thinking, for the benefit of the PhD candidates and so forth, I would love to hear more after I present my project about how you're engaging with legal research. And I know that there's some ethnographic research being done as well in your project. So that will be interesting to hear. I mean, in my view, I think the Global Compact is complementary to kind of the hard instruments of refugee protection, including the Geneva Convention, in the sense that it is kind of filling the gaps that aren't covered by those instruments in terms of responsibility sharing, as you mentioned, and also the duty of states to promote what is known in the refugee field as a durable solution, or the possibility of rebuilding your life in the absence of specific obstacles owing to displacement. So I think that's a really interesting kind of umbrella framework for something that actually that we're working in our project. The project is called Tempro. It questions whether the increasing provision of temporary protection can be understood as a durable solution, with a particular focus on policies that we frame under the umbrella of the return turn in asylum law. And I know there's a Dane sitting in this room, and Denmark is probably one of the most well-known jurisdictions in terms of really pushing return policies as like kind of the new core of the asylum system, and seeing both asylum seekers and also refugees as basically future returnees, and organizing both integration policies and also interpreting the convention itself and its inclusion provisions in a way that makes protection very contingent on an ongoing protection need. So the idea from the project basically developed from our observations, not only following the Summer of Migration in 2015, but also before that, in terms of the increasingly, I would say, innovative ways in which states are trying to deter refugees from seeking protection. We've seen, for example, the outsourcing of migration controls, whether it's in the Pacific Islands or in Libya, Mexico, basically all over the world. Aggressive pushbacks at sea and on land, and we've also seen how states are relying on sort of safe zones within countries of refugee origin in order to deny protection. So while these policies raise all sorts of legal, policy, ethical issues in terms of where protection can be accessed, what we wanted to do is draw attention to more indirect deterrence measures that make the duration of residence and the stability of one's refugee status sort of more temporary. So whereas previously, only a few years ago, someone who receives refugee status would often in the countries that we're looking at, specifically Denmark, Norway, and the UK, would receive a temporary residence permit to begin with, but where there would be an expectation of permanent residence as kind of the norm, to a situation where all people with different kinds of refugee status are subject to these temporary policies. So we wanted to look at sort of how these policies and laws are being justified, and what effect they have on the lives of refugees from certain nationalities, unaccompanied minors, for example, etc. So the project is a collaboration of legal researchers and anthropologists, and we can talk later about how we're intending to work together in a sort of interdisciplinary way rather than as a sort of multidisciplinary project, which is the mode of working that the partners that I have on the project have been sort of accustomed to working. So I think that will be really interesting. The policies that we frame within what we call the return turn include the provision of short-term residence permits, not only a specific temporary status, but also giving short-term residence to refugees, including resettled refugees. And I think in the context of a global compact, this is really interesting, that even refugees who've been identified by UNHCR in countries of first asylum or being resettled to countries in Europe are now not granted permanent status or a pathway to permanent status, but are explicitly granted temporary protection, which in my view is quite a challenge for at least the spirit of the global compact. We see the introduction of regular protection reviews of certain nationalities, like in Norway. There was a lot of discussion around the protection reviews for Somali refugees. In Denmark over the summer, the government has signaled that we'll start reviewing the protection status of Syrian refugees. So that's another dynamic that's quite new. The increasing use of time-limited residence permits, for example, for people whose identity is in question. In the Norwegian context, they can live indefinitely with one-year protection permits that kind of get renewed and renewed and renewed. And one kind of consequence, I think, of the coronavirus crisis on these aspects of protection are that in addition to kind of like the very dramatic consequences, closed borders, containment, and so forth, just the fact that people aren't able to renew status in the same way leaves kind of a protection gap. It leaves people out of status. It leaves them perhaps with, challenges to meeting income requirements in order to get permanent status, and all sorts of kind of under the radar challenges that people will be facing. And as I kind of suggested just now, another kind of trend that we see are increasing obstacles to receiving permanent residence, including income requirements, language requirements, knowledge requirements, and so forth, that we suspect might also have a gendered impact on how these policies play out. Yeah.
And I want to ask both of you quickly before we go to the rest of the panelists.
Yeah.
You said that you could, both of you said you could come back to how you're actually going to do this in terms of methods and so on. We really want to.
Yeah.
So could you just each take 1 or 2 minutes, just say something about listening to this.
Yeah. Okay. How are we researching? Well, as I said, we are only legal researchers and anthropologists. So in a sense, we are working ethnographically, and we're working with kind of traditional legal methods. What we're doing to bring these two together, instead of like the traditional, I would say a traditional way of working empirically as a legal scholar would be to have a legal question and then to gain some evidence, empirical knowledge about how, for example, a law is applied in practice, or, for example, the way a law might conflict with another law or another norm, or so on. What we're trying to do is use kind of bridging concepts from the broader migration literature. In our case, we're using the concepts of precarious inclusion that has been developed by to several of the anthropologists at UIB, and also the concept of legal subjectivity. So how people themselves see their legal status and what difference it makes in the way they organize their lives. So those bridging concepts we think will be very useful in terms of how we work together. So for example, I am working together with anthropologists in Norway and the UK now in our first kind of phase of the research. And so we're developing kind of an interview guide for this first phase, which will be with some stakeholder kind of elite interviews with, for example, practitioners working with refugees, solicitors, barristers, and so on, to find out sort of how policies have developed over time and so on. But when we're developing these questions, we're not only, as a lawyer, I would be sort of interested in how does their specific legal status affect what rights they have and affect the duration of these rights. So that would be like my preoccupation. Whereas my anthropologist colleague, I noticed, is noticing that, for example, in the UK, it's not really status itself that makes people feel like they're in a precarious situation. It's moreover the quote, what is known as the hostile environment in UK immigration law that makes even citizenship destabilized, because there are so many more opportunities for revoking permanent residence and citizenship, that this kind of leaks into the experience of residence also for refugees. But it's not in the same way where you see it like in Denmark and Norway. There are specific policies that are passed, and that has a consequence not only on individual refugees but also in refugee communities. So I think I would say bridging concepts is useful, and also working together from the very beginning to kind of identify the research questions instead of trying to integrate at the end.
Very interesting. Super.
Yeah.
I look forward to hearing more about that over when you start the
Project. Yeah.
So before I give the word to Håkan, those of you who are in the room, but also those of you who are participating online, you can ask questions, and we'll take the questions after we've heard from the other panelists as well. And you can either ask the questions as written questions in the Q&A, or you can also raise your hand online if you want to, and then we'll allow you to speak. But Håkan, 2 minutes from you as well. How are you doing this?
2 minutes, we have 8 work packages, scientific work packages, and each of them are looking at different things. It's not like what Jessica is doing. We have 8 different work packages.
You can choose.
Oh,
You can choose.
I can briefly mention each one of them, but I will not be able to go into details. My lawyer colleagues are looking into the different ways of linking the Global Compact provisions with the human rights instruments that exist and other refugee protection instruments. And they are doing this by gathering lawyers, practitioners, state officials, politicians in big rooms with 1 meter's distance, of course, and making them speak about this, create ideas and noting them down. They are like legal focus groups, and they're trying to find innovative ideas about linking the Global Compact to international law so that we can get a law status for this with a link to human rights concepts. This is one of the things the lawyers in our project are doing. The political theorists are looking at the ethical aspects of the Global Compact. What ethical considerations might be lying behind all this thing, where human rights are seem to be a bit difficult notion to have during the international negotiations about this. The political scientists are trying to devise the institutions at national, European and international level that can best take care of the rights of the refugees and asylum seekers. We are doing this by looking at the performances of different ways of organizing institutions and refugee protection practices, and whether they could be useful also in today's concept. The past performances, then we are finding the best performing institutional architectures for protecting refugees. This is an empirical work. Concerning the fieldworks, what our ethnographic colleagues are doing is that they're trying to observe whether the global compacts themselves, even its idea, have some effects on the minds and ways of working of state officials, people helping refugees on the field, where refugees enter the European, Canadian, and South African borders. These are only a few of the, and also concerning the recognition part, which I mentioned in my presentation, we are looking at every sentence in world media that includes the word refugee and international protection, and trying to understand how the media representations of these phenomena have changed as a consequence of the global compacts or during the processes that led to the global compacts. And we are doing a global survey of citizens' attitudes to refugees and what they know about refugees and how they want the refugee protection to be. So there are a lot of things that are done in the project, but what binds all this together is that we are trying to find the core conflicts that hinder the development and protection of the refugee rights. The global conflicts, the national conflicts, and the regional conflicts like in Europe, and the keys for solving these conflicts so that we can promote the rights of the refugees in political contexts. Of course, this is about the about decreasing the impact and influence of the nativists in politics.
Thanks a lot, Hakan. I think it's really interesting to get more concrete sense of, for everyone to get more concrete sense of what everyone's doing. And they can go to your webpage, to the Protect webpage, to see more.
There's some more there.
But now we're going to include people who are not physically with us in Bergen, but who we would really, were supposed to be here, and we would really have loved to have them. And who also do very much empirical work related to the migration regimes, if you want. So the first panelist to join us on Zoom is Professor Jeff Staton from Emory University in the United States. And I've been very fascinated by the projects that Jeff has been doing with relation to migration in the US. So please, can you, I don't know if he's with us. Are you there, Jeff?
Yes, I'm here.
Wonderful.
Hi, thanks for including me. Just apologies from the beginning. I'm coming to you from my dining room. My son's going to high school in his bedroom. My daughter's going to college in the living room, and my wife is teaching on the porch. So hopefully this will work out. I was asked to talk a little bit about the kind of interdisciplinary research that we're doing in the Immigration Law Lab here at Emory. The lab is a collaboration primarily between myself, I'm in political science, Hallie Ludson at the law school, and Dehanza Rogers, who's in film studies. The lab has undergraduate students as a part of the group, graduate students, postdocs, but the thing is the setup is a sort of student-centered research endeavor. So rather than, we have research ideas in the level of the professors, which we execute, but we try to foster an environment of creativity where we encourage our undergraduates to develop ideas that we can actually turn into actionable projects. The lab's also connected to academic legal clinics, both at Emory and at Georgia State here in Atlanta, and to the advocacy community more generally. Sometimes nonprofits would be clients of my law partner, but sometimes they're just research partners on the social science side. The basic principles that guide us, the idea is that legal, political, and scientific challenges that we confront are really too complicated to tackle alone, and they require an integrated research team that complements each other's skills. We're pretty convinced that we need to be contributing to a bunch of academic fields, and that's kind of an interesting challenge to think about how to do that successfully. But we also have to make sure that what we're doing is speaking to identifiable matters of law and policy, which sometimes those two goals can come into conflict. So let me just give you two examples of projects that we're working on that illustrate sort of, you know, the interdisciplinarity of the project. The first is a more vanilla project, I suppose. The research question is aiming to understand or estimate the effect of placing the burden of proof in custody hearings in the context of immigration detention on the detainees. So when the custody hearings in civil detention and immigration, the detainee or the respondent has to make the case that they are not dangerous to the community or flight risk. This is not a burden that the government bears. So what's the effect of that on the ability of a detained individual to obtain feasible bond? So the social science component of this starts with recognizing that in the late 2019, the District Court for Massachusetts in a class action habeas proceeding produced an opinion which reversed the burden and placed it on the government. And this gives us an opportunity to engage in a couple different types of pretty standard social science analyses. Whether we can use one method or another really depends on what this landscape looks like nationally. And so on the legal side, we have undergraduates who are speaking with lawyers in every jurisdiction to figure out whether or not this is all unique to Massachusetts, because when you search the law itself, you'll find decisions like this, but we're learning a bunch of things about how precedent works in habeas in particular in immigration, which created a bunch of legal conundrums for our law side. And so they're pursuing sort of the legal aspects of that while the social scientists try to figure out some important challenges. So the natural thing you might want to do is engage in some method that allow you can compare before and after this change in Massachusetts, the bond outcomes to some set of other places. So there's a bunch of methods for that, but like a deep problem will be, well, what if the government changed the initial bond decisions that they make in anticipation of how this law will be carried out, or this new burden would work? And so just trying to figure out where you should look to see the effect and how your effects might be biased. That's like natural social science stuff, but it's connected to all this really other interesting legal issues. The second is really about, our second project has to do with dramatizing court observation experiences. So so what are we doing? Court observation, right? This is projects where largely NGOs, human rights organizations are bringing civilians to watch what happens in immigration court proceedings. They do that to collect data on what's happening in this space, to influence judges and lawyers' behavior, but they also do it to influence the observers themselves, to change their opinion. So one question that we're interested in is, what would the effect of observing immigration court be if you could get like everyone in the United States to go? But you can't, right? And so the first thing, so what we're doing is we're filming them, okay? You can't film inside an immigration court, so we're having to dramatize it. And the second reason that we're doing it is actually to help the organizations that are doing court observation and collecting data inside of those courts. So one thing they might want to do is measure how professional the immigration court judge is. Do they treat people with respect, something simple like that. The people that do court observation in Los Angeles do not do it in Seattle. They do not do it in Boston. You only ever do it in one place. So how do you construct a scale of professionalism that you can put every immigration court in the country on, right? When the people doing the data collection never go to all but one court. And so in social science, like a pretty common technique that you would use is to create vignettes, which every person that would be doing this observation would respond to. They'd be stories about things happening in immigration court, but these are stories on paper, and they're going to be having experiences in real courts. So what we're doing again here is dramatizing these things and allowing them to answer questions with respect to the fictional experience that will allow us to link everyone together. Finally, my colleague in film studies, Dehanza Rogers, does some just incredible work dramatizing people's experience in education system and now in immigration space, and really thinking about the way that race impacts so much in our society, but these particular experiences in education and in the process of migration. So it's not just that Day will be doing work with us to do the social science piece, but she's learning about this experience. And the whole idea is to have it inform the kind of humanistic style inquiry that she engages in. So I'll stop there. Thank you so much for the opportunity to share what we're doing.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Jeff. Very fascinating, interesting to hear the work that you're doing, and also to hear that you're taking ideas from students as well and developing it into projects, which I think a lot of what you're saying also links to our last panelist, who is actually a PhD student on the course that this seminar is part of. And his name is Edgar Cordova, and he's joining us from Mexico. And he's done field work both on the southern border of Mexico, but also on Lesbos. And he's not only an anthropologist, he's also a photographer. And he has, we will show you some of the photographs. We've had trouble with the video, but maybe we can show the PowerPoint, or that he can. And he will tell us about also his work a bit, but also use of photography as a method.
Hi, everyone. Hello.
Hello. Hello, Edgar.
Hi, good morning from Mexico City, and thank you very much for inviting me to participate in this very interesting roundtable. So I am going to show you some pictures about my master ethnographic fieldwork on the island of Lesbos in 2016, where one of my goals has been to approach intersections between humanitarianism, securitism, and racism, to analyze the effects of the laws through their documents, bureaucratic paperwork, and waiting on asylum seekers. Lesbos is an island located in the Mediterranean Sea between Turkey and Greece, and serves as one of the primary gateways to Europe for many of those fleeing wars from countries in Middle East and Central Asia. Once a place of transit, the agreement reached between the European Union and Turkey in March of 2016 has seen the island become a place of detention, lack of legal aid, and denial of access to justice and asylum for thousands of migrants trapped in overcrowded and violent humanitarian spaces, journeyed into detention centers. So in these borderlands where policies of life and death are created, also as a method approach, I volunteer in a small humanitarian organization at Karatepe refugee camp, a space where 1,000 of asylum seekers, mostly from Syria, Afghanistan, and Iraq, were living in very precarious conditions under the management of the Greek government, UNHCR, and also the European Asylum Support Office. So once inside, I got involved in different humanitarian activities, such as the distribution of clothes, food activities that allow me not only to document the daily life of the refugees, but also to show the unequal power relations that are established between them, volunteers, lawyers, security agents, under the umbrella of a humanitarian regime, many times based on principles of compassion, sometimes victimization also in a post-colonial framework. However, I also found a cosmopolitan space, and I think that's the richness of the ethnographic approach, where refugees, tired of uncertainty and waiting, also re-signify humanitarian activities as new forms of visibility, political agency, and also socialization with volunteers from most of them from the global north, in order to destabilize their representations of what a migrant and a refugee must be. So in addition, also, I was interested in photographing these refugees beyond Karatepe refugee camp, where they joined anti-racist and pro-refugees movements and participated in several demonstrations against some of the migration policies, and also to denounce extreme violence in other humanitarian spaces, such as the very famous Moria hotspots, what I call a black hole, where several people have died as a direct result of the conditions in which they survive under an extremely slow and collapsing asylum system. So also here we can see how the effects of the law affects the bodies and the subjectivities of migrants. And in relation of the methods, of the photography as a method, I want to start with a little example. Contemporary migrations are one of the most mediatized phenomena today. So we can see how WordPress photographers, journalists, and activists are photographing thousands of racialized bodies in precarious boats at the Mediterranean Sea. So we can start by asking, are we talking about border struggles or a border spectacle? These images are not empty repositories. Some people see evidence of human rights violations toward victims who are left to death in the sea. Others see political agency and the ungovernability of migrations. Other groups also can criticize an hypermediatization of necropolitical violence and sufferings, while some states also use those images for anti-migration purposes, to make migration seen as threatening to public opinion. So in other words, the image have power. The image are empowered by circulating. So when we use this approach in a refugee camp, when we are approaching the subject of photography in a refugee camp with people situated in unequal power relations, it implies, above all, an ethical, political, and epistemic discussion to avoid reproducing a methodological extractivism. So instead of only asking ourselves, how can I photograph migrants so that I can later describe my fieldwork scenes, maybe we can also ask ourselves why to photograph them, how can photographing migrants contribute in somehow to improve their lives, and also how do we engage with representations we generate about migrants. So one thing is that beyond photojournalism, focus on the immediacy of events, I want to stress that anthropological photography requires a process of critical reflection on current processes, but also taking into account its historical dimensions as the archives, the testimonies of migrants. So hence, the image is just a node where different records intersect. Anthropological photography should not be an isolated method alien to social, political, and historical conditions in which it's carried out. And secondly, photography as a method must be based on every life as an axis of social analysis, as the ethnography as well, to focus on local contexts and resources that people deal with day after day. So this is where we can see agency. Many times we as photographers, we are seeking to repeat the great, dominant, and spectacular narratives while we put aside those apparently banal images that make us rethink what resistance is in extreme situations. For example, improvising a kitchen with firewood to make a local dish, or refugees rejecting the food that the humanitarian agencies are giving, or for example, refugees joining activities to try to overcome the pain of the war. So these images make us see how the camps are not always those exceptional spaces in Agamben terms, but rather places where practices, representations, and identities are disputed on a daily basis. So also photography as a method is patience, everyday life, and trust. And the last point is that also the denunciation and the visibility of the others through the photography is not enough if there is not a detailed political intention, plan, and also dialogic with who is photographed. So the challenge is to be vigilant, is to be aware in the thin line between denunciation and the commodification of pain and exoticization. For example, in Karatepe, many times I saw many journalists who were going to take photographs that follow editorial lines. So young orphans posing in the most desolated places in the camp, re-victimizing them, while at the same time, dozens of kids were helping to build a football yard, for example. So as soon as those journalists left, you could see how those same persons who were interviewed left the camps to participate in demonstration against policies while posting their disagreement on Instagram. So also photography tends to aesthetics migrant sufferings in order to satisfy consumer demands.
So thanks a lot, Edgar. This was absolutely fascinating. And I think that between you, you've been able to really show the importance of diverse perspectives and diverse methodologies. We're almost out of time, but I would like to have the opportunity for people here, but also people who are participating in the webinar, to ask questions if there are any one or two questions that people might have. I don't know if we have, I can't actually see if there is any. No.
No.
Is there anybody who would like to ask a question? If not, yes. Yes, you can use the microphone and just say your name before.
Hello, my name is. Hello, my name is Eric Aunu. I'm from Roskilde University.
Mm-hmm.
I would like to ask all the contributors to what extent they use participatory methods in order to avoid mediating the voices of the migrants by letting the ethnographer speaking or the political scientist, but having the voice, the direct access to the voices of those we are studying. Are they research participants? Are they research subjects?
Mm. This was a very important question, and I think it's a very good question to have in the final round. And we'll do the reverse order. So Edgar, you can start, and then you can also say whatever. I mean, it can take a minute or two because we started late, to have the just short but the fine words. Do you use participatory methods? How do you avoid being only the ethnographer speaking, Edgar?
Sorry, I can't hear very well. It's not very clear to sound. Can you repeat the question, please?
So the question that was asked from the audience was, do you use participatory methods? How do you avoid only mediating the voices as a researcher, as an ethnographer, political scientist, and so on?
Sure. One of the resources are, for example, in relation with photography as a method is, for example, to make photography courses where also refugees and migrants can participate by taking pictures and also represented by themselves. And at the same time, during the ethnography, also as a volunteer exercise, that allows also to have more access to daily life in order to establish or to try to establish more horizontal relationships, but without forgetting that as a students, we are also situated always in power relations. But I think one of the main aspects of the ethnography as a method and also as a epistemological also discourse is the possibility to share with migrants a daily life experience where you are not anymore like as a reporter or someone who just arrives for 1 day and after it leaves. I don't know if
I think we need to go. Thanks a lot. Jeff, is this something that you're discussing how to engage in more participatory research?
Yes and no. I mean, part of it's disciplinary thing. So we currently don't have an anthropologist working with us, and so I would say the human subjects in the active research projects are not migrants, right? The subjects of the study are judges or they're activists. This is not to say that the immigrants are not a part of what we're doing. And so the yes part, and I'll be as brief as I can, we have a student who is very interested in understanding the ways in which stories and placing stories in the context of larger statistics influence human rights campaigns' efforts to generate empathy. And so she's telling stories in this study of people's migration experience. And what she's doing is trying to work with lawyers, organizations to link up with individuals to see whether they would be comfortable telling their stories and linking, the stories to the actual experiments that she's doing, so that's not that they're real tales.
Thanks a lot, Jeff. Jessica.
Okay, briefly, the answer in our project is happily yes. I'm working with two anthropologists, Ezra Ketez and Mikkel Ritter, who have been working on a project called Art Life with Afghan refugees in the UK and Denmark, in which they've been working with medium like film, dance, theater, photography, to try and capture experience together with refugees that they're working with. We also have a podcast. So I'm not sure. So they're really eager to build on this experience in this project, and I'm not sure how it will play out in practice yet. But we also have a podcast series that we're starting called Refugee Law and Refugee Lives, in which part of the idea is to train some of the refugees we'll be working with on how to produce podcasts, and they'll be responsible for part of the series. So we'll see how it plays out, but that's definitely the intention. Yeah.
Håkan, as the last one, in the Big Protect project, how are you?
As research subjects, we have a large spectrum of actors, states, governments, municipalities, other local authorities, citizens themselves, civil society organizations in different work packages, of course. So these are our research subjects. And the degree to which we include participatory methods depends on the methods that we have to use. In our surveys, for example, we leave categories that are open, that they that they can define themselves instead of readily made. We have some theoretically prepared our own categories that they can choose between, but then they can add other categories if they want. So this is a way of defining the research, even in surveys. We have an ethnographic work package where we have a heavy inclusion of participatory methods. This work package is led by the Center for Gender and Women's Studies at the University of Bergen by Professor Christina Jacobsen, who has long experience in using participatory ethnographic methods, where refugees themselves define the topics that are important for them, and where the research will go concerning the global. Of course, we have to have a thematic focus on the global compact itself, but then how this is going to be expanded upon depends on the answer that we will get from them. Yeah.
So thanks a lot. Our time is up, but this has been, I see this just as a start of a continuing conversation, and we'll have many conversations, maybe throughout this semester and later semesters and new Bergen exchanges, because these are topics that are important, both in terms of substance, but also in terms of discussing research methodologies. And for those of you, and you all should be, who are curious about Edgar's photographs, they will be posted online so that you can all go and watch them, even if we didn't get to see them now. But maybe we can also try and show them on the monitor in the break so that you can have a look at them. Thank you all for participating, the panelists, people here, the people who are in the webinar. And I also hope to see you back on the new Zoom link in this same room for the next seminar, which starts in 10 minutes on the right to water. So thank you very much.
Thank you.